This is the interpretive display. And the content key. Steve's guidebook gives a good explanation. From here, this is what we see. Now this was the site or the center of old ancient Athens. The Acropolis up above it. Actually from here you can take a spur road that cuts into the road, I think, that goes up to it, although this may be even a separate but more steep road. Because of the trees, we can't get a complete sense of the extent of this area, the Ancient Agora, but that's probably that wall over there, may be that far limit, and then it goes off to the right here a little ways. But as Rick says, you can think of this as the center of any town by any name that they're called: commons, town hall, town square, downtown, whatever. That's what agora means. Now, following Rick's cue, if we look to the left, that long building with the red roof is a reconstruction of the Stoa of Attalos. It would have basically been a large mercantile shopping building, if you will. And it would have been building number 13. 7 and 14 are way over there on the other side of the main road that goes up to the Acropolis. The opposite side, behind the trees, we can't see it, is a temple of Hephaestus. And I think that's number 22. And that's number 20 here. Main street, the Pan-Athenic Way, is this right here. And this road, which I said ties into this one, which is now the main tourist road, and is the road you take up to the Acropolis. And that's where that procession occurred yearly, and this is that road. So you can imagine that a couple thousand or more years ago, once a year was a phenomenal procession. I think it included elephants and other kinds of animals and circus acts and music and dancers, as well as probably the religious mucky mucks who probably led the procession. I'm sure you can find something in Wikipedia that gives great detail. Went through the Popolia, which is that building that we see up there with the reconstruction work on top, and then proceeded up to the Acropolis, or to the Parthenon itself. And just ahead of us are the 3 remaining pillars of the Odeon of Agrippa. Odeon meaning theater. There's one, that may be a stump of one. Oh no, there it is. There behind the tree, a tall one, and there another tall one there. This is it. This is the remains of that magnificent building. It originally began as just a market center, you know, in a small town, and then they progressively filled it in, first by ringing it with a building like this and another stoa here and perhaps some other buildings here, and then successive generations needing to glorify themselves or gods would build buildings in the only remaining space, i.e. in the center. Now 26, which is the altar of the 12 gods, I think is that hole. I'm guessing it is. Why it's a hole, I don't know, but Rick points out in those days it was considered to be the geographical center of Athens, which is rather curious, since now most of even what we think of as, what I think of here as this ancient area, seems to be behind me, except for that which goes up to the Acropolis and off to the left here where Hadrian's library is. We'll get a closer look of this when we complete the circle. I'm taking my cues from Rick's audio guide as I pan about. Everything that I'm panning through would have had a perimeter here of marbled buildings, temples, theaters, etc., surrounding what was the inner square. In addition to that, everywhere, as you'd expect at, let's say, a Saturday market, even in Jackson Hole, would be lots of shops selling not only food to eat, food to cook, take home, but also trinkets and other kinds of typical gewgaw that, frankly, on the street that runs from here that way towards the Monasteriki or Stoa Square is absolutely filled with those kind of little retail shops. So as always, we, with great futility and failure, attempt to imagine what stood here. What was on top of these bases? Columns, no doubt. What was the building looking like? Did it have that triangular pediment? And were there carvings, and was it all painted in beautiful colors? Are these stones in the background the remnants that hopefully someday, when Greece or the world has far more money than now, it decides to use as the basis for the reconstruction of this building? Kind of stone is always fascinating because it presumes that a message for the future was being left. And it's too bad that they don't bother to interpret it for us. I wonder also whether this represents the destruction, and apparently it does, of earlier writing, probably in order to either make it fit or make something fit on it. But you can see how this line here seems to go along like that. Those are the kind of things I look for. They're meaningless probably, but to me they imply that some conscious decision that was made in the history of this stone. What is this the remains of? Now, before we enter into the area of the Stoa, we'll take a look at another pan, if you will, of the center of the square. Of course, at one time there was nothing here but a weekend market, if you will, or daily market, and then it subsequently filled in so that at some point in time before us would have gleamed these white buildings, or maybe not white, maybe underneath white marble, but then beautifully painted. And people came here to do everything: get a building permit, get a wagon wheel fixed, have lunch, see plays, worship at shrines and temples. It was the center of Athens. A few tidbits. There were approximately 100,000 people living in Athens at this time, including such characters as Socrates. I mean, at this point for me, it's like standing at some kind of indefinable boundary between reality and myth. And yet, this validates myth, proving that it's more than myth, that it was in fact another era's reality. This is a faithful reproduction of the original building built in about 150 AD. And this was built by the American, I think he said, Architectural Studies group or organization. And it was, in essence, the ancient shopping mall. This is remains of a statue of the cult of Apollo Patrus. And this is a personification of Odyssey, whoever that was, although it looks female. This is the statue of a goddess. No surprise how that became a euphemism for a beautiful woman. This is a statue of an ordinary woman. And perhaps you can decipher the difference. This is a statue of Hermes, or Hermes, Hermes, from the stage front of the Odeon, remember that means theater, of Agrippa. That perhaps is what it looked like inside the theater. The head of a Triton from the Odeon of Agrippa. And this is a statue of Aphrodite. And I think as a consequence of looking at this, I'm getting a tingling in my loins. Here, another statue of a woman. Notice the contraposition, but in the opposite way, with the right foot stabilized and the left foot starting to move forward. Look at this. It's just another way that man has represented a story. This is the story of Hermes handing over the infant Dionysus to the nymphs in the cave of Pan, which, of course, we are all familiar with. But what I did think to myself was, in off-planet societies, extraterrestrials, who may have different sensory capabilities, or different levels of sensory capabilities that we have, how would their art be reflected? What medium would they use? There's always a certain melancholy that I feel for the artist who created this those thousands of years ago, that he could never know that it would still have a greater immortality than even his own society. In fact, it stood in for that immortality. Fragments of reliefs, but it doesn't say where they were positioned, whether it was on the original Stoa or one of the other buildings here. The torso of Athens. Notice the holes. Those would have been for installing something, perhaps some kind of brass work. And then if it were painted, you can imagine how dramatic this might have looked. Those fragments of red paint in the center, 2 of them, reflects the victory of Kratos and the race at the Pantheonic Games. You know, how they differ from the Olympic Games, I'd have to go back and see. The difference is inherent in the name. These were races of Athens as opposed to all of Greece. The statue of Themis, Themis. But what's interesting is the bowl-shaped cavity that presumably held a separately sculpted head. But was this a strategy for economic creation of statues? I've seen that kind of thing before, where the statue torso was one of many replicated torsos, and then the head was just made for each particular statue. Mix and match, if you will. The Emperor Antonius Pius. They had so many during the course of their 1,000 years. This is interesting because it's obviously a specific architectural element of rather significant size. It had to be uniquely important. It had benches. Was this where important people of the marketplace sat? Interesting. You wonder if this is a remnant of the mosaics that might have been on this floor in the original temple. You would hope so. That's a marble pestle. Interesting, because it has that handle-like shape, almost like a whale's tail. This apparently is a well that was excavated, and those colors show the different levels, which probably reflect, as it does on the left-hand column, the time periods in which these various items that we're looking at were tossed down the well. It's interesting how trash mindens, if you will, and wells have become some of the greatest sources of the only artifacts we have from various civilizations. There's a little oil lamp. Here a couple more. No big surprise, but the contrasting irony of my having a cell phone that has a brilliant flashlight built into it. Remember, these little lamps were ubiquitous, just like all the flashlights that we have hanging around. Notice that one there with the 3 hold protrusions probably had ropes, so it could hang in a kind of a permanent state. And several of the others you might carry around with you. Find small artwork like this intriguing. That's a brass snake with a human head. I'm not sure the camera can make that out. More elaborate, if not phallic, lamps. More elaborate ones. This is a statue of a youthful satyr with a Pan's pipe holding a goat. But notice the kind of joyful, happy face. How beautifully represented that is. This is the ivory crossbar of a sword hilt. So the blade would have come from this side up this way, I believe. Probably with just enough flex to allow it to fit quite tightly. Here we see one of those sword scabbards, and you can see I was wrong. It looks like the sword went in the other way. This may be an example of some lost wax bronze casting. Looks like it. This is where it might have been used, as you can see from the white portion up on top of that horse. Please resist the temptation to presume this is the first example of a depiction of a hula hoop. Probably most everything in this museum is better seen at the National Archaeological Museum, which I'll go back to. They're pretty cool cooking devices, or barbecues, if you will. Of Dionysus. Why it's plastic, how they use that word, I'm not sure. Unless they mean it was just a material capable of that detailed sculpturing. Perhaps some of those little tickets that a juror would have, a potential juror. You can even see some letters incised on that. This is something that America should use, impractical as it may seem. As long as there was a quorum of at least 6,000 present, people would leave these shards of pottery, scratched on which were the names of the people they felt most undesirable in Athens. Those who received the greatest number, I don't know how many of those, but those who received the greatest number were ostracized and forced to leave Athens for 10 years. Child's commode, or toilet. These were funerary objects left in a woman's grave about 750 BC. Very small terracotta boots, but for what purpose, I don't know. It's just to have in your home. Of course, we use them as a planter. And these are the remaining fragments of a charioteer toy on a mock-up. Nothing clearly states what the significance of the 3 horses is on this device and the one we saw. Fascinating. It's a young girl's grave that was found beneath the Stoa of Attalos. Now, I don't know if that means it was found underneath this one that built, or whether it was found under the original before they built this one. These are the grave goods. Here, a wooden comb. Sometimes I've seen these, of course, in other materials, including bone and ivory. But oftentimes they're called lice combs. Apparently a bronze Spartan shield loot, L-O-O-T. It was a water clock, and it was used to time speeches. Presumably, see down at the bottom there, you can see a little nipple sticking out. There's a little aperture there. So when that emptied out. You were done talking, period. It was a stele that represented and stated apparently on it at one time that tyranny was outlawed. Now, how that could have had any credence, more so than our Constitution or a sword, I don't know. These are scraps from the original column of the original Athlos. From the original Athlos. Upstairs is the current American University. It stood about right there when I was videoing this Odeon of Dionysus. And this is the other theater, I believe. But no, this one I don't think was built, but we did see the two columns. Don't yet know what this is. On my understanding, I thought this was used for administrative, but I'm not clear. Remember, this is a faithful reproduction, and now it's the American University. Again, I'm not sure where that's located unless it's just simply behind those glass walls. These may be reconstruction example models, if you will, of the buildings that once may have stood in this ancient agora. Some of the tools used by the architects and artists to reproduce, reconstruct this agora. And here we have a physical version model created by this architectural American University. See how it would be almost like being, by analogy, in the center of one of our larger cities where there were major buildings as well as park-like areas. Here, everything more concentrated. Today, everything so huge that it necessarily encompasses a much greater area, and individual functions and buildings may be spread out quite a bit, even like Jackson, where the city hall may be 2 or 3 blocks away from the main square. Okay, now we're walking along a road that goes perpendicular to the Stoa at the end that we entered it, far away from where we first entered the Agora itself. And these are the remains of the Middle Agora, it was called. And so we can imagine it might look like the one we just visited. So we've just walked by on the left side this Middle Stoa. In the background, running from left to right, is the Stoa we were inside of. If we were Athenian citizens, we had nothing in particular that we had to do except lounge about and philosophize and whatever you do when you got all the time, because slaves are doing everything for you. I like that idea. Of course, modern machines do a lot of what slaves did then. And here we're looking back at those columns of Agrippa, I believe. stand that the Stoa would have looked like with accompanying chariot horse statue. This is one of 6 Corinthian columns that, or top Corinthian column tops, if you will, or capitals, that embraced the entrance to the Odeon of Agrippa, which are those 3 statues there. So exactly where this column was, I don't know. But the point they make is that this was a late stage, seldom used Athenian architectural innovation that the Romans were enamored with, and not only took these Athenian capitals and incorporated them into their Roman buildings here, but then it became a style probably throughout the empire. And you'll notice down there's a remaining fragment of the base of one of these capitals. Yeah, after walking about 100, maybe 50 to 100 yards, you encounter the well. Here it is. Notice those grooves from where the ropes over time wore down into the stone. There may be access to what's called the Great Ditch. Well is up there. You can see it to the left, right where that lady is. And this is the Great Ditch, as Rick calls it, but the Great Drain, as they call it here, which brought the water off of those mountains to the left where the Acropolis is and into Athens. Apparently a juncture of the Great Ditch, coming from there where the well is, right there down through there, and then over from the right down underneath that bridge this way, and it still functions apparently, bringing rainwater. Some of the stone remains of the Great Ditch. Notice how it reflects exactly the same design as you still see in old ruins everywhere, as well as in some modern towns. This capping of a drain with stones of some sort. Might properly be called the center of Athenian democracy during the 5th century BC, 450 something, I think it was, called the Thorlos. And in here is where the members, apparently, of the Athenian Senate met. So this is where the 50 counselors were not only met, but were housed, because 1/3 of them had to be on the premises at all times. And these may be reconstruction example models, if you will, of the buildings that once may have stood in this ancient agora. It used to have 6 columns, and in the center was a altar where that column base remains, and then it had a conical roof to it, which sounds novel. Drawing looks rather simplistic, since they said there were 6 large columns on the outside of it. I wonder if the Athenians would see what we call democracy today as a phenomenal travesty of their principles, a mockery of it, or simply a historical extension. I think that's the temple of Hephaestus. Don't ever repeat my pronunciation.
Walking down, and where do we end up?
Hopefully we're there. But anyway, what I'm saying is, look at the map, it's just amazing. You can see the whole city, how it used to be. You've got the remains of everything there. It's that one there.
Right there.
Isn't it that one there?
No, it's probably that one there. I think it's that one.
Is it the tallest one, right?
I think it is that one. There is that one. There's that one. So there's gonna be a tram that goes up. That'd be so sick. From there.
Este es un recinto que falta el museo para ver. Para ir ahí arriba hay que salir del recinto por ahí y subir. Pero si subes...
This is the temple of Hephaestus that we have seen from many locations. Probably the most complete temple that we're going to see. How much of it's restored, I don't really know. What's kind of interesting is to see how some of the column drums have shifted in their vertical orientation somehow, in spite of what should be metal pins inside the center of them. What's interesting, you still see the reliefs in the metopes. We'll look a little bit closer at what's left, both on the outside and the inside. Not much really, but adding some truth to the rubble we see. Can't make out any real forms. Oh man. Not much to see really. Not sure if we can get a sense of that curvature on these stones or not. Of the temples I've seen so far, this is one of the most interesting because it's the most complete, including the walls inside the first set of columns to the second set, and some of this frieze, if you will, up there, but also the normal walls that enclose the cella or the sanctuary on the inside. For the first time we're actually seeing one that looks to be whole. Notice that these are the simple Ionic columns. Notice how those have eroded away so substantially. Huh. Here we may even have a better view of these metopes. Let me see if I... The headless statue of Hadrian, and you'll notice that if we look closely at the emblem on his apparel, it's Romulus and Remus suckled by a she-wolf who raised them, and on top is Athena, and it was his attempt to represent that by conquering Greece, Rome was then able to elevate it and preserve its culture. He was also known as El Greco, I think, or something like that, because he was so enamored with Greece and Greek culture. We've once again intersected the Great Ditch. They're interesting. You wonder what they're for. What it would have looked like. So this is the Odeon of Agrippa, the theater, if you will, of Agrippa, and it had two phases. It was built by the Romans, but in the early days you entered originally from up there near the middle Stoa, where we saw that capital we looked at closely that was Corinthian. And then it apparently, I don't know, collapsed during 2nd century AD, I guess. And it was rebuilt not as a 1,000-person seat theater, but as a 500-seat person lecture hall. And it was then that these statues were apparently installed. There used to be 6. There are only at least 3 plus the one pedestal. If you're wondering where all the stone went from all the buildings that once were here, that we only see remnants of, part of the answer is in this wall. Around the 3rd century AD, the Herillian barbarians, as they called them, came from the north and laid waste, literally, and burned Athens to the ground. What Athens did in response was to take all of the damaged buildings and use their material to build a wall 30 feet high and 10 feet thick to keep the Herillians of the future and any other similar barbarians out. So what we see here is a mixture of all of the different stoneworks, including column drums that you see there. Not the first time I've seen this. I forget exactly what the town was in Eastern Europe that I saw the same thing. Ironically, it was probably in roughly the same time period because it was a Roman town that had literally cut a path through itself using stones from the houses that it destroyed to build a monumental wall to keep out another batch of what were called barbarians. As a post note or an insert, I have a video, a 2-part video, that shows that quite the contrary, they were not barbarians. It's just what Caesar managed to end up calling them, so that he could denigrate them, as we do, as all man does to anyone he wants to denigrate and therefore ultimately subjugate, ridicule, whatever. And in fact, they were not barbarians, but the Romans, including Caesar, wanted their money. They already used copious quantities of their wine and other things in their culture. So that was a giant chunk of Caesarian hypocrisy. By 700 AD, this was basically totally abandoned and outside the city walls, cannibalized as a quarry for the Athenian homes inside the walls. The third Athenianic walkway, and on the right side is this small Christian church built in the year 1000 on top of a pagan site when the Byzantium Empire was able to protect Athens, and there was this revival of the Agora at that time.